2.5 weeks. Here to build a relationship with you. Having said that, while I've been here for 2.5 weeks, I have been with the University of Adelaide for 37 years in terms of my association. Undergraduate started in 1978. And I guess we're keen on building a relationship with you for a couple of reasons. Obviously, our mission is about spreading knowledge. From a personal point of view, I'm an economist because of two teachers in my life. One was a high school teacher who actually taught religion, but it's a long story about why he taught a non-believer economics. But he taught me how to think, really, about anything, which of course economics apply. And one of my early teachers at the University of Adelaide many years ago made the difference between me liking economics and not.
What was his name? Because I'm still on a vintage. Okay.
I'm probably not judging by how I look. No, Cliff Walsh. I don't know if you know Cliff. Cliff was, it's a bit of a long story, but very quickly I started my economics degree in 1978. I wasn't switched on to economics in my first year, nothing against teachers of the time. Christopher didn't teach economics here at the time. And then a guy called Cliff Walsh, who was appointed a full professor, I think he was probably 30, certainly no more, walked into a microeconomics 2H class one day. And suddenly the light bulb went off. It was fantastic. Not just in terms of knowledge of economics and communication, but demonstrating a passion for the subject. And that's what changed me. So here I am many years later, still passionate about economics. But actually, I mean, as you would know, getting people switched on, using sort of real-world case studies and examples of key policies or events, particularly ones that actually have the potential to affect our lives, all of us, in quite substantial ways, is a real way to get students engaged. Which is a perfect introduction to today's topic, I think, given China-Australia free trade agreement. Christopher is going to talk about the opportunity, and David's going to talk about how we have got to this stage and the way forward. I should actually say a few things about our two speakers. Christopher, I think, probably needs no introduction to you. He's well known to the Economic Teachers Association. Also, as a former University of Adelaide graduate many years ago. And of course, he's had a...
Before you started.
I thought about saying that, but and Christopher has really had a research and policy focus throughout his career on Asia, particularly reform in China. So, of course, he's very interested in the free trade agreement. And David, of course, David is Executive Director of our Institute for International Trade. A lawyer, but don't hold that against him.
I'm coming to like economy.
And in fact, David has, I think, been involved in the negotiation of 15 free trade agreements on behalf of the United States, as you'll be talking about, including the one with Australia, I understand. Plus, as well, a delegate to World Trade Organization, APEC, and so on. So, clearly substantial experience in useful matters. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over, I think Christopher's going to go first. We do want this to be as interactive as possible. So nominally, we've sort of planned it for Christopher and David maybe talk for 20 minutes each, leave plenty of time for questions and discussion at the end, but we don't want you to hold your questions until the end. By all means, if you'd like to ask questions as we go along, I think that'll help all of us and it'll be a much more interesting discussion. So feel free at any time to ask your question. I hope you don't mind. We'd like to videotape this because we thought it might be helpful to your students or some of them. We'll try not to get you in the camera unless you want to. But we're going to make this video or excerpts from it available. If any of you or other teachers wish to use it with your students or potentially ask about it in your schools, we'd be very interested in talking with you about that. Okay, so Christopher's on first.
Good, thanks very much, Paul, and welcome everybody. It's great to have you here today. As you may recall, I was in Paul's job at an earlier time. Cliff Walsh, too, was someone who had a huge influence on me. But when I was in Canberra as a master's student at the ANU, so in 1979 or so, he was maybe
He must have just been
78.
Yeah.
Maybe it was 78. So he taught us a public economics class. It was just stunning and reinforced for me the value of sticking to that program and since. So what David and I thought we'd do today is talk a little bit about the what of a free trade agreement, about the why we're doing it with China, and then a bit about how it might pan out and what we know so far about the agreement. Of course, we're both terribly expert on this, but the fact is that nobody's seen the text of this agreement, right? So it's been announced that, yes, there's going to be an agreement. There's a summary on the DFAT website, and we sent you the link to that so you can see the things that the officials are releasing about the agreement, and our material today will be to some extent based on that. What will happen is the text will be released, when do you reckon?
Well, they say April, but these things tend to be anywhere from 1,500 to 2,000 pages long, and what it's going through now is what's called the legal scrub. The lawyers for both sides are sitting down agreeing as to what was agreed, and if it's written in the right legal language. I think April might be ambitious, but with any luck, we could see it April, May.
And how many pages, what's your estimate of the number of pages?
Oh, at least 1,500.
1,500 pages.
Yeah.
We'll come back to that number in a moment. So,
Piece of cake.
piece of cake. So, what is it, and then why are we doing it? So, we're interested in the difference between types of trade agreements. What we're talking about here is a discriminatory arrangement. So, trading partners sit down, they negotiate with each other, they agree to cut tariffs or remove other barriers to trade or investment, but they only that reduction only applies to the other member of the agreement, the other party. So
Members like to call them favorable agreements.
Favourable agreements.
As opposed, discriminatory sounds so nasty.
Okay. Favourable or discriminatory, it means there's another bunch of people out there who don't get those terms and conditions. I would say that it discriminates against non-members.
That's because it's honest and accurate.
But that means you've got to have some way, you know, if some product arrives at a port in China and it's got stamped on it or pinned to it a little message which says, "Trust me, I came from Australia, and therefore I should be allowed to enter at the concessional or favourable tariff rate," the Chinese officials are going to go, "Wait a minute, that's not enough. I actually need some more evidence that this really did come from Australia." And so associated with these sort of arrangements are very complex rules about to determine what the origin of a product is, the rules of origin. And they can be very complex. They can be even descriptions of production processes that must take place in order for a good to qualify for the terms of the agreement. Or they have to be evidence that there's been a certain amount of value added in the country which is claiming the origin. Because you know, these days in production processes, a lot of goods are made from imports. Things come in, they're processed, they're exported. That's modern business. And so if you don't add enough value in the country which is the member of the agreement, the other party might reject the product. So usually there's, these rules are laid out. Probably, do we know what rule of origin they're going to use in this agreement? Do we?
Not sure, actually, but
and it's often hard to predict, and it often varies product by product. So,
yeah, that's right.
So one of the reasons why the document might be 1,500 pages long is that there'll be a separate rule of origin for each product laid out in the background document.
But here's a guy who finds this interesting. Brooks, are you a runner?
No.
No, but that's a good running shoe, Brooks.
Yes, I do have those shoes. I'm a good walker.
You're a good walker, all right. Well, you should try to invest in the last American running shoe, New Balance.
Oh.
The New Balance. Hey, I'm plugging good old American goods here. Good old American goods where the upper is made in China, the sole is made in China, they're shipped into the United States, and about 100 stitches later, it's a shoe. That's all they do in Massachusetts is so the top to the bottom.
Made in America.
And it's made in the United States.
Yeah.
It's the last American running shoe.
Yeah. and that sort of production process very common now. In fact, smart businesses know where they should locate themselves in that sort of production process.
Can you just elaborate on rule of origin?
So the rule of origin is a description of the condition that a product must meet in order to qualify for the favourable treatment. And like I said, it might be in order to qualify, you've got to have 40% of the value of the product created in the country from which the product actually physically came. So you could have a whole bunch of it imported, but it's got to have a certain proportion which is actually built.
In your example, that's very expensive stitching.
Well, is it the value of the stitching or the value of the product after you've done the stitching? The top of a shoe ain't worth much without a sole, and neither is a sole without the top.
So it's a value-added criteria. Some process adds value to the product, and that's the measure. In services too, we'll come to service. We'll talk a lot about services today because they're a big part of this agreement. So likewise, you've got to have a rule of origin on services. That's a bit harder to define. It's usually like, is the provider an Australian, or is the provider an Australian company, some such ownership, or is the company which is providing the service, you know, maybe someone's exporting architectural services to China, is that company predominantly based in Australia, or some such description. So yeah, got to have a rule of origin, because otherwise, if we negotiated a free trade agreement with China, suppose we got the tariff down to 0, and there wasn't a rule of origin, then who should we pick on? The New Zealanders. You know, they'd just ship it across the Tasman, and then ship it from here to China, and then claim that it was an Australian origin product. The incentives to do that would be huge, and so the free trade partner would become like a funnel to the other side. So to avoid that sort of trade diversion, they impose these rules of origin. But you see where I'm going with this, because that means for business, that makes it, yes, there's a favourable treatment, but you've got to go through all these hoops to demonstrate that you actually qualify for the treatment. And there's a little bit of research that says that, especially for small firms, that exercise of going through demonstrating that you qualify is a massive amount of time. So some people say, oh, free trade agreement, I'll just use the normal tariff rate. It's called the MFN tariff rate. You know, the rate that would be applied were you not a member of the agreement. Because, you know, if the margin between the normal rate and the favourable rate isn't big enough, you don't get compensated for the work you have to do to demonstrate that you meet the conditions.
So would they break the hundreds of thousands of items potentially to be traded, or services as well, into categories to try and streamline that?
Well, no. I think they do it line by line.
Line by line.
Line by line.
Product.
Yeah. 1,500 pages in the agreement.
Well, it's going to keep someone in the job.
And we have one of our
Lawyers.
lawyers. We have an esteemed colleague here whose PhD thesis was about characterising those rules of origin and trying to understand which rule was used for what type of product. So his thesis was that the bigger the margin of preference, that is, the bigger the gap between the normal tariff and the applied tariff, the tougher it would be to meet the rule of origin. So that, in other words, the preferential access would be then essentially re-litigated, renegotiated through the rule of origin negotiation. Would you, in the negotiations, do you do the two together, or do you do the tariff rates and you go down and sit down on the rule of origin?
Well, you do. Well, they play off each other.
Yeah.
Because one definitely reads on the other, depending on how you define it and how you agree to it. If a certain amount of value add has to be there in order to call it an Australian product, for example, then if in your manufacturing you're importing most of the inputs and you're not adding that value, it doesn't matter what they drop the tariff to. You're never going to get the treatment if the rule of origin doesn't meet what you're producing. So they do play off one another. And you have to, and as a negotiator, it's really actually, it's pretty tricky. You have to keep track and understand what it is that you've been doing for 1,500 pages. Because somebody else on the other side is keeping track of that. So if they can get once in a while get one over on you, they will. I don't have to give that away because I'll keep it over here. So you have to be pretty, that's why this agreement and why this text might not come too quickly, because the lawyer's poring over it right now.
Does the value add determined simply by the price?
Yeah, you'd have to document what you spent on your inputs, what the value of the final product was. Usually you have to have it certified by a third party. Chambers of Commerce sometimes provide a service to their members to do this sort of reporting. And then you'd have to, as you ship the product, as you exported it, you'd have to have that paperwork go with it in some way, so that when it arrived at the other end, the customs officials at the other end would accept that it was the particular product that you're saying it is, and that it qualified for the lower tariff.
Geez, this sounds like a terrible idea. Why would anybody do this?
Correct. So, you know, there'd be both sets of customs officials would have the big book of tariffs. You know, it's a bit like Monty Python reading the book of names. You know, the sort of product comes in, turn the page. You know, a series of columns, different tariff rates depending on different trade agreements, WTO rate, all the other agreements. Which product is it? Find the right page. Which country does it qualify? Find the right column. That's the tariff rate. And I think, yeah, there are a fair few people who make a business out of facilitating that process.
Oh, yes.
Customs agents and...
Customs agents, consultancies.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who don't want to sit with that book or with that stack of papers.
And sometimes there's these they're called tariff lines, aren't they? And there's a descriptor of each tariff line. But there's you can apply a bit of judgment about which tariff line your product should be classified in, because the tariff lines are fixed in time, but products keep evolving. So maybe I can shift my product to a different tariff line. So that's another service that a customs agent would provide, right? They'd help you get your product classified in the right way to minimise the impediment.
So this is a boom industry for people who are studying law and economics.
There are some employment opportunities there.
I can give you an example of why you want to get that right, because you look around in South Australia. Here is very much involved in the defense industry. Is a good example, because defense contracts are enormous. Maybe less so these days. Maybe everywhere above the water they're still involved pretty well. But some of the defense contracts that Australia has with external providers are in the tens of billions of dollars. We have for many years to come billions of dollars worth of defense-related materials coming into Australia. Some of those come in at zero tariff because we don't make any of it. So there's nothing to basically guard against or offset. Some of it comes in with a very minimal tariff, maybe 5%. So if a light armored vehicle that we don't make comes in at zero, but a heavy armored vehicle comes in at 5%, and you're only talking about $1.5 billion worth of them, what's 5%? When customs calls and says you classified this incorrectly, what's the value of the deal that you made as the company or the purchaser? And what's the consequence when you have to pay the 5% that you weren't aware of? It's a big deal.
It's a big deal. So to keep moving here, another way of getting an insight into the nature of these agreements is to contrast them to alternatives. So instead of negotiating in this preferential way, you could go to Geneva and negotiate in the WTO. So the WTO means that the discussions could still be held bilaterally or in small groups, but whatever commitments you make in that group to the other trading partner becomes available to everyone. So the commitment you made and write down there isn't discrimination against other trading partners. So that's a critical difference. I'll get David to tell you his WTO analogy in a moment. The observation is, and the big research question is, what's the trade-off in using WTO compared to free trade agreements? The advantage of the WTO is that you're not discriminating against anyone. the problem with a free trade agreement is that if you have a tariff of 10% on two products, sorry, the 10% on products from the same product from two sources. One of those to say is competitive, so that you buy it from there, and then the tariff is paid, the 10%. If you go preferential, drop the tariff on a source, on one of the sources, if that source is only sufficiently competitive, you'll switch your purchase. But the cost of that import might be higher than it was from the lowest cost source that you were previously using. So you're worse off in that case. Because previously you were buying from the lowest cost source. Yes, you were imposing a tariff, but you were getting the tariff revenue. If you do a preferential deal, take the tariff off one of the import sources, your purchases switch to a higher cost source, and you're not getting the tariff revenue. So from a national welfare point of view, you're not as well off as you were. You're buying the stuff more expensively, and you've given up the tariff revenue. Essentially, you're handing over the tariff, some of the tariff revenue to subsidise the import from a more expensive source. Sometimes that's not always going to be the case, but that's one of the big concerns, that it will shift the trade pattern to a more expensive location. But sometimes the benefit of free trade agreements are that you'll get a better coverage. It's a smaller negotiation. You might be able to deal with more issues. You deal with things that you actually find difficult to deal with in the WTO, but which are important impediments to business, including, say, investment, which isn't covered well in the WTO. Analogy?
Well, you want me to describe the WTO? Okay, but this is complicated. So, it's, what time is it? It's 5 to 6. This take a while. I got the phone. I'll order in pizza. So, because we're going to be here a while if I'm going to describe the WTO. So I like anchovies. Everybody like anchovies?
Yeah.
A couple people, yeah. Wow. Got a lot of it. No, okay, no anchovies. All right, no anchovies. Then meat lovers, right? Everybody likes meat on a pizza? No. I'm sorry I pointed you out. The one who's going to cause us not to have meat on our pizza. We'll have a vegetarian pizza. Everybody like veggies on their pizza, onions and capsicums and all of that. And no, all right. Anybody lactose intolerant? Can we at least have cheese?
Nope.
No cheese. All right. Anybody allergic to tomatoes? Gluten-free? Tomatoes. Okay, no tomatoes, and now we're down to maybe gluten-free base. That's the WTO. What you get as an agreement is the least amount, is the maximum that the least member can agree to. If it's by consensus, that's how you do it. You can't order pizza in a room with this many people on it because you end up with nothing. Well, you have to work hard to get some level of ambition when you have 160 members. A free trade agreement? It's you and me. What do we agree on? There's got to be something. Got to be something we like, and you start, and you can take that to the highest level ambition that two parties can get to. So bilateral gives you the most flexibility that you can have in an agreement.
And that would explain the trend towards bilateral agreements.
As he says, the WTO is like ordering pizza for 150 people. Very hard to land on any pizza at all. Whereas if you've got a smaller group, you can agree. But what's likely to happen is that you guys will order.
How are we splitting the bill?
Yeah, well, that too.
Get there.
But the design of the pizza in this negotiation would likely be very different than in that negotiation. So yes, you can get more agreements, but they'll all be different from each other because we all value different things in the agreement. Or flip side of that is we're all sensitive about different things depending on the trading partner. So in relation to a low labour cost country, we might be very sensitive about some manufactured products, but if we were dealing with the US, we wouldn't be so sensitive about those particular manufactured products.
Well, another thing is that not just what level of ambition for talking about a subject, but what subject you can talk about. Because if you're talking about labor from a low labor cost country, You might also be kind of interested in how they treat their laborers. Do we want to flood our country with goods that are made in places that are substandard or unsafe, or people aren't being treated well? That's not something you talk about at the WTO. Not very often anyway, not very much, and not at a very high level. But you and I could talk about that.
So to continue this contrasting of the preferential agreement with alternatives, it's useful, I think, to think about the APEC process that you've no doubt heard about. So APEC is another large member group, but in the case of APEC, there is no binding agreement. So they do discuss how to reduce trade barriers, but they don't do it in a way that involves any formal commitment. What they tend to do is to share experiences of the reductions of protection, and they tend to look for ways to support each other in implementing those changes, so-called capacity building. So that's a different model again. So in the WTO, people can move at their own pace, can't they? They don't all have to have the same reductions in protection. Likewise in APEC, but it's not a binding commitment. So it might be useful to, when you're thinking about what a free trade agreement is and what it means, is to think about the differences in these options. If you worked only through APEC, then it would be a more like a unilateral commitment. You just say, we're going to reduce tariffs, we'll write it down, we'll tell everyone about it, we want you to know about it because we want you to know what we're doing, and we want to know what you're doing, because that will help us understand what our opportunities are. So it's a much more establishing a common way of thinking amongst a group of people. So we'll come back to dimensions of the what in a moment, but why did we...
Christian, that means that they talk about it a lot, but it does or doesn't happen.
There's been reasonable progress in reductions in protection amongst the APEC members. If you're interested in that model, there are some great materials on the APEC website where they've been tracking their progress. A bit difficult to sort out what they've actually contributed to compared to what's happened in all the other formal processes that are going on at the same time. But I think it's an option worth thinking about, and from what I've seen, it's been very important in creating the atmosphere for change in other formal contexts.
One thing about APEC to keep in mind is that it's not one set of meetings. It is there's the overarching organization, but in that there are, I think, literally hundreds of subgroups that meet on different topics. And one of the great things is that quite a few of them fly under the radar. So the people who are sitting in those meetings in APEC and doing norm setting are the people who regulate that area. And because it's under the radar, and because they're not getting calls from reporters and it's not on the evening news, they can sit and talk to each other about it. And because they are professionals in what they do, the guy across the table isn't necessarily a competitor. He's the guy who you can commiserate with because he suffers through the same thing you do, but he's got a different set of circumstances and he can bring you some insight that you won't have. And so they actually make some really interesting headway in some of these things. And then they bring it back to the wider meeting and everybody says, wow, APEC's pretty smart, aren't they? And it's these little meetings sometimes that contribute quite a bit.
APEC's especially good, I think, at working on the regulatory barriers to trade. You know, sometimes you get regulatory systems which aren't aligned, and so you meet your domestic system, and then when you go to export, you've got to meet a whole new system. So if you can establish some regime that will recognise what you've already done, or if you can align them, then that will get rid of that impediment. And sitting around talking about those things with a bunch of like-minded trading partners, so we want to get things moving here, then that can produce a good outcome. So why did we negotiate with China? A whole bunch of reasons, I think. Let me mention some, and then David will supplement that. Perhaps one of the contradictions is that why did we negotiate with China? Are we doing okay there? I've given you a single, what's called the fact sheet for China, which is produced by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and we'll put one of these on the relevant website as well. So for each country, each significant country, for Australia, there's one of these one-page sheets. So they're a really good resource, I think. You may have seen them and be familiar with them. They've got some recent economic indicators. They've got data on the growth of trade, GDP growth in the country of interest, China in this case, and Australia's trade with China. You can see in the middle of that document that China ranks #1 for both for our exports to China and our imports. Exports and imports. So Australia's major trading partner. It's got some examples there of the sorts of things that we trade. Resources dominate the export set here, and on the import side, clothing, telecom equipment, computers, furniture are the big items. There's some services trade data there as well, and there's some foreign investment data also. And down the bottom, the position of Australia in China's trade. So handy little sheet. So yeah, we were already doing well with China. You could see in the chart on the left in the middle, our exports have been growing strongly in the last few years, but we still wanted to negotiate a free trade agreement with them. One argument would be that, well, yes, it's a big market, it's growing rapidly, our exports are growing rapidly, but there are still significant impediments to trade there, and so there were additional opportunities that we could get if we could negotiate with them. So as an indicator of those opportunities, we've also given you a couple of other resources that might be useful. One is, over the page, there's a couple of sheets with for Australia and a couple of sheets for China, and the source of these is down the bottom left. So this is a WTO document. So these are average tariff rates. So for Australia, you can see that the up the top, Part 1A, the simple average final bound tariff and the simple average MFN applied tariff. The bound tariff is what's written in the agreements and what people have agreed to. The applied tariff is what they're actually applying. So usually the applied is less than the bound.
Yeah, it sounds a bit shady when you say it like that, and you go, without explaining that, quite often what a country will approach another one with is they'll say, listen, we have a bound rate of 28% on this. For you, we'll lower it to 15. You have to know that they're already charging 10. And what they're doing is taking away their ability to go up higher. They're not actually giving you anything, but for you, we won't go any higher than 15, even though for everybody else, that given any desire, we can go up to 28.
So you can see at the top of the table there, for Australia, the simple average final bound tariff average on total is, the bound tariff is 10%, but the applied average is under 3%. And it's lower for Australia, it's lower for agriculture than it is for non-agricultural products. So if you turn over a couple of pages, you'll see a sheet with China on the top, Part 1A, simple average final bound, simple average MFN applied. The average bound rate for China is interestingly also 10%. The applied rate, however, is 10% on average, and the ratios are reversed. So China has very high tariffs on agricultural imports, both bound and applied, and the applied rates are very close to the bound on average, likewise for the non-agricultural imports. So there's one of the stories for Australia. We wanted to get access to protected agricultural markets in China. There's a bit more detail in the tables below, and you can see for different products what the rates are.
So those original bound rates, are they by agreement?
David, they're the ones that are negotiated,
Yeah,
aren't they?
that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's
But
right.
they sometimes called water in the tariff.
Well,
So
what happens, for example, if you're a member of the WTO, you have to bring your schedule in accordance to what's required by the WTO. And it, again, least common denominator. So a lot of countries come in better than what they need to the WTO. But they give, this is our offer and these are the rates.
So what it means is if you had a bound tariff at 15 and you're currently actually applying it at 5, and there was an import surge, yeah, there'd be nothing to stop you going back to 15.
Shoot right up to 15.
Shoot right up, and you wouldn't. They couldn't. Your trading partners couldn't take you to the dispute process in the WTO because you were still within what you'd formally committed to.
Or you do what China does. If you take a look, it's 10% is their average bound rate. They're magnanimous in charging 9.9.
Well, I mean, that's the point of my question, I suppose, was not so much about the technicality of the bound rate versus the applied rate. It's this perception out there that Australia enters into free trade agreements, and whilst we benefit, we don't benefit by as much, that we in some way are getting shafted, pardon the French.
No.
Well,
and that somehow or other we're better off still, you know, keeping the course of agreeing to free trade and opening up, but we seem to be taking the rough end of the pineapple a little bit.
You know,
that's anecdotal, but
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot of political commentary about that.
I was a trade negotiator for years. That was really polite. There was no French involved in that as far as I was concerned.
so yes, we could be subject to other people returning their applied tariff to the bound rate, but in the WTO they couldn't do that in a discriminatory way. They'd have to apply that same rate to everybody.
Mm-hmm.
So one reason, I guess, for people to negotiate FTAs is that you don't have that option in the FTA, do you?
What's that?
You know, there's the preferential rate.
Yeah, no. What you agree to, you've agreed to.
Yeah.
You still might have some room from where you actually are now, so you can agree to a certain rate, but it's and charge less than that. As long as you charge less than that, nobody's going to pull you up on it.
Yeah. So down on the bottom of that Australia table, you can see exports to major trading partners and the duties faced. So you can see that for agricultural products, China's a major market, and we're facing a tariff rate there on average for our products of about 15%, and 30% in Japan. So that's one example of the motivation for us wanting to be involved in signing that trade agreement. Also giving you some other extract from the OECD website, which might be a useful resource as well. This is new work which measures the degree of restrictiveness that applies to services trade. So this is quite interesting, and in fact some of our colleagues here contributed to the collection of the raw data that's gone into this new index. It's called the STRI, the Services Trade Restrictiveness Index. So this is trying to get to a way of measuring the degree to which international business in services is impeded by government policy. So basically, there's a chart there on the first page. Basically, the story is that the degree of restrictions applied in China is much higher than the average. So the average is the little red dots of the 40 countries that are included in this exercise that the OECD did, and the numbers for China are the height of the column. So you can see that in some areas the degree of restrictiveness in China is many times that of the average, and many times that of the lowest number. So this is another reason why Australia would want to negotiate with China. It's that Australians saw prospects for exports of services to China, and yet they were finding they were faced with impediments related to government policy. So they wanted to see if they could deal with those in the free trade agreement as well. A couple of other reasons why we negotiated with China, and then David will say a little bit more in a moment about why the Chinese might be interested in negotiating with us. China had agreements which discriminated against us, so that they'd already signed with a number of smaller countries who sold competitive products to us. The Chileans, they had it with Chile, yep. And the New Zealanders. So a couple of other agricultural exporters were getting preferential access to China compared to us. We were being discriminated against. We wanted to see if we could remove that degree of discrimination. At the same time, we had agreements in place with the US and also more recently with Japan and Korea. So that meant we were discriminating against China. So from our national welfare point of view, it seemed to me that we wanted to remove that discrimination to make sure that we were sourcing things in the most efficient way. There's another motivation for signing with the Chinese. But maybe, David, you've got some points over here about why Australia might be an interesting partner.
Yeah, I mean, we're 24 million, to be generous, 24 million. That's not a large city in China. It's right, probably somewhere in the middle of the road as far as cities go in China. Why do they want to talk to us? Why would they want to give us a good deal? They have a lot of power at the table. If you're bargaining with someone who has less bargaining power than you do, what's the incentive to come to a good deal? Your question was great because what you said, Australia keeps getting shafted. Actually, Australia is pretty good at these things. In the scheme of things, they've had some good success. The point of a free trade agreement is actually a partnership. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not I win and you lose. And the benefits can't be measured against each other very well. If your economic outlook, if your jobs, if you're going up, you benefit. If they go up, they benefit. But how do you measure the Chinese economy against the Australian economy? You want to use percentage? We're going to affect them this much, and they're going to affect us this much. We win. You want to talk about how much money they're going to make? We might make this much, they might make that much. They win. You're economists. The numbers, you can make them say what you want to say. And I'm a lawyer, so I have to believe you. But one of the things we do quite well is that we bring friends when we go to trade. But does China need friends? Is a good question. In 2003, this is what Australia's trade relationships looked like around the region. Not very substantial, and not terribly effective. You see where Australia was kind of outside the ASEAN circle and outside of what ASEAN +3 was there. Here's the Pacific Islands, and we were talking to them because they're there, and that's largely it. We were in APEC, which, as Christopher described, one way you can look at it is a brilliant norm-setting organization, and another way to look at it is like a British police officer without a gun. Stop, or I'll yell stop again, because it's not binding. So if you do it if you agree to do it. This is what the picture looks like today. In a little over 10 years, Australia is one of the only countries that's square in the middle of all of those conversations. They are negotiating, just about one of the only countries I know that can say they're negotiating with India, have an agreement with the United States, China, Japan, and South Korea. So if you want to talk about how trade is done in the Asia-Pacific region, this is not a bad country to come to because we have somewhat harmonized rules with a whole lot of them. And we negotiated packages that basically, to the best of the ability of the negotiators, favorable for Australia. One of the really hard parts of an FTA, we were talking about rules of origin before, just to get back to the shafted idea, you have to take advantage of it to get the benefit. So are you going to go through all of that to identify for rules of origin purposes that you deserve this benefit, or are you going to step back and say, oh no, that's too hard? The benefit just passes by. What the government's done is take a lot of the barriers away, lower some of the impediments, and try to step back. If the ability is there to step in, you can get those benefits. If it isn't, you're not going to get them. But does China need friends? This is absolutely just an opinion. And later on we'll talk about Australia and China and trade, the relationship between them. But China, if you take a look, TPP is one of those things. And China is very seriously now debating and internally, quietly talking about joining the TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership. The United States, some of the Latin American countries, Canada, Japan, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. This is a big, big deal. And if China joined, it would be a really big deal. But China and the United States, you know, the clash of the titans. How do you get that? How do you start that conversation? How do you get to be part of that? Well, getting to be friends with the country that is basically at the center of Asia-Pacific trade is not a bad start. And we're 24 million people. What are we going to produce that's going to scare away China? They could give us a good deal. So, in a way, kind of buying a friend. But it's nothing wrong with that for us. They're not asking us to do anything that's not trade or not principled. Here's a great deal. You tell us how we're going to trade together. We'll make up our rules, and we'll go forward. And it'll be an offer you can't refuse. And it was. It's a good one. And we win because of it. And it stems out of that strategy that Australia has taken. They put themselves in this position, and China looked at it and said, hey, those are the guys we need to talk to. Those 24 million people, they're a pretty big deal.
But it also made sense on complementarity grounds, didn't it? So we had things that they genuinely wanted to buy.
Oh, we were a really good customer and a very good provider. Yeah. One of the things we've talked around a little bit, is that in the global economy and regional economy these days, the way things work, you have to be a good importer in order to be a good exporter, in order to service your own markets and be efficient. So it's not a win-lose. We win and they lose. We're better off for being able to import from them in a lot of ways, and them from us. Our raw materials is just a tremendous asset for them. Our agriculture production, it's terrific. I was at a conference today, and somebody mentioned the fact that Australia feeds approximately 60 million people. Neat trick for 24 million people. Well done. Good on you. Somebody's eating this stuff. They got a lot of mouths to feed. They like to hear from us. Not only that, we'll get to that, but our stuff is the good stuff. We don't just produce stuff, we produce good stuff. And that's a market they like. That's a product they like. And that's a good reason for them to want to talk to us.
Paul, do you have something?
Yeah, to what extent has the resources boom helped Australia get to the middle there? Would we have been able to get to the middle to a large extent without the resources boom?
There's a bit to that. It certainly is, and you can't. I think it would be very difficult to draw a picture of where we would have gotten without it. It's just because it dominates everything, every conversation. However, there are politics involved and cultural reasons involved. Again, when I say we bring friends for more reasons than just the iron ore in our back pocket. It's there's value in this that goes, for China in particular, that goes to trade, but goes beyond trade with Australia. It goes to trade on a broader scale. They like to pose for photographs. And,
So
and this
it's-
helps.
It's strategic.
Yeah, absolutely.
But
I
not,
often wonder about that, in the textbook or the old Johnny Foreman, economics machine, what are the 4 reasons for trade? And down the bottom is political strategic. And I'm not sure about the politics with China, but certainly strategic.
Well,
and
it's-
when you quote, kids say, what are the examples of that? I'm sort of reluctant to say China, because I'm not sure that they really do give much of a damn about us. But I'd be maybe mentioning Indonesia, which is, in the terms of defence issues or sensitivity or volatility in the area, the geography would be, you'd argue, that case.
but I think David's saying that China's willingness to engage in this form of agreement has a big benefit for them in terms of their wider regional.
Yeah.
Right, so there's a strategic reason for doing it, but it makes sense in economic terms at the same time.
Yeah.
Before we go on to talk a bit about the agreement, let me go back to the Huang slide. Huang, that one. So Yiping Huang is a famous graduate from the Australian National University, has had various jobs at the ANU and also in Chinese universities and also in the financial sector in Asia. And he's a regular author on this website called East Asia Forum, which I highly commend to you. They're usually pieces of the order of 700 words, so like opinion pieces in the paper. I can assure you that they're heavily edited, absolutely crystal clear, and brilliantly edited as well. So Professor Huang quite often writes about China and what's going on. It's a terrific resource. There's literature there on all the Asian economies, and easy to use, easy to search. So if someone was doing a project on India, it would be a good place to get some material. But Yiping has been arguing that China's growth model is changing, and that's that bit of language I just wanted to rehearse with you because it's an important piece of context here. So he talks a lot about the deceleration of growth and the rebalancing of the economy. So his expectation is that growth rates are going to be of the order of 6 to 7% over the next period, compared to rates up to, as you see in the chart, 9+%. So you can see the downward trend in the growth rate in that middle chart. At the same time, the shape of the economy is changing. The balance between the different sectors is changing. He says these changes have been mainly caused by rising wages and the emerging labour shortage. So China's got to the point, the earlier stage of development was built on this the shift of labour from the countryside, from agricultural production into urban areas and into manufacturing. And there was a big pool of labour that could be drawn on, and it wasn't having much, the withdrawing of labour out of agriculture wasn't having much effect on agricultural production. There was plenty of labour left to get that done, but that labour could find much higher productivity use in manufacturing. So there was an increase in income as a result. That's terrific. People can live in urban areas instead of in the countryside. Their incomes go up, but there comes a point at which that flow starts to bite. That there isn't just the pool of labour that you can continue to draw on for that purpose, and that's his reference to the emerging labour shortage. What happens then is that wages start to rise, and as wages start to rise, they cut into, as he says, they cut into the profit margins, into investment returns, and into export competitiveness. But they increase household income. So the model of growth that's based on that transfer of labour into manufacturing and then into exports, that starts to be unsustainable because China starts to lose competitiveness, especially in that more labour-intensive end. So whole lots of adjustments start to happen very quickly. You see things like industry relocating, believe it or not. You thought that
this has happened, this isn't predicted.
This is happening, yeah. So activity that was based in coastal China, the wage rates tend to vary between regions of the country, might move west because the wage rates might be lower there, or they moves to Southeast Asia where the wage rates are lower. The remaining manufacturing becomes more suitable for high-cost labour, so it's more labour productivity rates are higher. It might be more technology based.
Can I just make a comment, because I've travelled to China quite a few times over the recent years, and in one place we were, there was the mayor was having this sort of big campaign going on, and the whole thing was, we've got to really watch and not increase our wages because India's there. And in so many places they said, India's going to take over from us if we're not careful. And that was, I heard that, you know, over 10 different places.
So they've got a big.
They've got this sort of.
How can we maintain our competitiveness?
Whether they're using that
where's
to kind of.
Where's the growth going to come from? But where the proposition here is that where the growth comes from, it's much more driven by domestic consumption. So, and rather than export-led, it's driven by the purchases of households. So that's possible because household income has gone up, and also the income distribution has improved as well. So what he's expecting is that the consumption share of GDP is going to rise. So that's quite a shift in the model of growth. There's a lot of stuff on this in the literature. If you're looking for material on telling a story about China, it's a nice story to tell because you can talk about the different stages of growth and how they moved out of one into the other, and basically driven by a market process.
This is where we're hoping our Australian firms will be able to get a niche.
Correct. So what's going to happen is that we've still got the traditional market of resource-based trade, because there is still a high urbanisation rate, and that's what's driving the building of buildings and the building of infrastructure, which tends to be resource intensive. So that's not, the volume demand's not necessarily going to be, there'll be markets for the output of the ore that's being produced from all the capacity that we've invested in, and BHP and CRA what are they called now? Rio Tinto are doing their best to make sure it's them who's providing it. But the proposition is that because of the change in the structure of the Chinese economy, there'll be lots of opportunities for other Australian firms to export there. Now, particularly in the service sector, we gave you, David and I had the opportunity today to go and listen to Warren Hogan talk. So Warren Hogan's the chief economist at ANZ. He was in Adelaide today and produced this terrific little booklet which we've put on the table. If you turn to the page numbering's a bit uneven, but it's actually page 5. It hasn't got a number on it, but if you go to 6, then go back one. It's the relationship between income and the share of GDP which is in services. Have you found that one? Yeah, that one. And it's a classic picture, just a classic, almost a law. So as income per person goes up, you'll see an increase in the service share of output. Now, there's a whole lot of reasons why that happens. Part of it's the consequence of rising incomes leading to the demand for more services. I think the biggest driver is actually the reorganisation of production processes, because associated with the rising income is a greater ability to contract out, because there's institutional development going on, people are more confident about using markets, and then firms start making the decisions, oh, we don't need to do everything ourselves, we can get the trucking done by someone else, we can get the accounting done by someone else. There's much more specialisation, and it's another source of growth, because that's competition, that's productivity, all of that contributes to the continuing rise in income. You can see where China is, the red line down the bottom. They're just getting on the track, and if anything, I reckon they're a bit behind. So there's a proposition there that the service sector in China is going to grow quite dramatically, and therefore opportunities for Australian firms to supply services into China. Supplying services into China means either exporting them from here and delivering them in China, or it means setting up in China and delivering them there directly, or it means Chinese consumers coming here and buying services from us. So
Like half my class.
like half your class. And in this building, in my faculty, there's, you know, we host a very large number of students from China. Chinese tourism is booming. Not so much yet in Adelaide, but that was the pattern with Japanese tourists as well. We tend to be the destination in the second round when people are looking for a bit more of a differentiated personal holiday. They're more adventurous, more adventurous travellers, more familiar with international tourism. The early destinations tend to be Sydney and Melbourne, group-based, going to specific venues. We're in the second stage. So lots of opportunities for services. It is proposed, including in professional areas in which we might have some advantage. So at lunch today I heard a story about a Adelaide accounting firm which is off to set up, just about to launch its China business. It's already got a Philippines business. It's going to launch its China business very shortly. Sorry, interrupted.
Yeah, that's what I was just going to ask about, how easy it is for our Chinese, like the businesses to set up in China, but you just answered it.
Well, not easy.
No.
If you go back to the OECD numbers,
Yeah, that's right.
this will tell you what the restrictions are on setting up.
But has the free trade agreement dealt with some of those issues, or?
David, has the free trade agreement dealt with some of those issues?
Absolutely.
Let's turn.
I have.
Let's turn to the that sort of how's it going to be done and what's it going to mean for us stage.
Well, I quickly go to the comment about China and India and the conversation we were having around that about Hong. Just quickly to touch on that, because while it's a comparison that's made all the time between China and India, India is not China. And there's a lot of reasons that is not, that's apples and oranges when you're talking about competitiveness and whether or not they'll take the place of China.
No, this is just sort of saying
No, I know.
saying in China, you know, like to be.
Yeah.
Where a lot of that will go, if it moves offshore from China, is to their close neighbors into Southeast Asia, and it'll move there with Chinese investment. The Chinese will set up shop within their neighbors because it'll be more efficient to do so, and we'll see a lot more of that. Foreign direct investment from China into Southeast Asia.
Just a small little company, Stratco, but my sister works for them. They set up in China, they've been in China for 10 years, 12, they've now moved to Vietnam.
Yep.
There you go.
That's
Okay.
That's it.
Yeah.
Because
And they were making products to bring back to Australia to sell in the retail outlets
I
here.
think so, I'm not
Yeah.
sure
And-
exactly
yeah,
what
yeah.
they were making, but now
Yeah.
they've moved.
And
Yeah.
I certainly won't at all cast aspersions on the brilliance of Huang. However, from a non-economist point of view, I'm reading the story. So you're telling me that that the point is to create economic growth and development and job growth, so people start moving from rural to the cities to get work. And as they do, production goes up, money comes in, the welfare of people goes up, so the income comes up. So there's a bigger middle class. And suddenly they're spending money, and the economy is booming. And as it does, and as they get more and more and better, the price of labor goes higher and higher. And at some point, industry becomes less viable because of the price of labor. And so the economy shifts towards higher value, higher end products, maybe technology or otherwise, and services, as opposed to manufacturing. Manufacturing starts to go away. So this is what he's saying is going to happen with economic development in China. How insightful. What? You're describing us. You're describing the United States. Well, this is what everybody's aspiring to. They're becoming us with all of our problems that go with it.
It's a familiar path, but the big debate in China was, for a while, was when would they hit the turning point? So there was the expectation was that they could carry on in the old model for a lot longer. So I remember this Yiping's thing was written a couple of early last year, but about then it was settled that the so-called turning point had arrived. But up till then there'd been a vigorous debate about when it was really going to happen.
I say it somewhat facetiously, but this is where the value is, and this is why I've come to like economists, because knowing that or anticipating that is exceedingly valuable and makes that transition a lot easier. Because, I mean, look at what the United States did with its auto industry and what we did with ours. It cost a lot of money, and it's not here anymore, and it's not really there anymore in the same way. And had people thought to where the economy was going and should be, would they have invested all of that time and effort?
And it's a familiar story about Asia as a whole. So there's been a sequence of these sorts of relocations. And the part of the big story about Asia was the receptiveness of the next economy in the flow to take the foreign investment and relocate the manufacturing. So the growth in one then spread to the next and became reinforcing, because the new member of the group was able to provide inputs into the more established members. So there's a lot of literature now about regional value chains or regional supply chains that have been constructed as a result of this, driven by foreign investment, which is another important part of the agreement.
Absolutely. And how do you, and the idea of softening the growing pains that you go through as you move through different stages of economic development is really important.
It's really important. Actually, before David, yeah.
The government made that big announcement that China can't keep buying up our land. How does that fit in with a free trade agreement?
Let's come to the FDI story in a moment. Just before I hand back to David, the document by Warren Hogan is interesting because a very large part of it is about demography. A very large part of it. So business, I'm always so interested in the business analysts put a lot of thought and effort into this. They see it as a fundamental driver of what their opportunities are. So there's quite a few pages here about the shape of the population. David mentioned the growth of the middle class. That's in here too, and the growth of what he calls it consumer class. And there's a slide about the different mix of income groups in the population, and that all reinforces the idea that for a services exporter like us, there's opportunity there, and that led to the focus I suggest led to that focus on services in our stance on the agreement. But given the time, do you want to talk a bit more about the agreement?
Yeah, well, the first thing I had on there was foreign direct investment. It's dangerous because China is going to buy up all of our farms and all of our land, and we're going to be paying rent to Beijing pretty soon because they're going to own the whole place out from under us. This is terrible. By the way, if you hear any bit of sarcasm in my voice, it is, I was many years a trade negotiator. So it didn't matter what room I went in, whether I was at home or away, I was a bad guy. And this is the kind of reason, because now that we've done this, the Chinese are going to, well, you know, are we paying rent to them yet for this place? Well, maybe we will be.
We pay rent to America already.
But hey,
they own most of Australia.
That's an important point. The Chinese share of the foreign investment flow is very small.
It's very small. It's very small.
You look at partial leases.
Correct.
Yeah.
None of them are owned by Australia or this many.
But people also think that the free trade agreement tend to think, you've heard to the contrary already, but that it'll be easy to do business in China now because we have a free trade agreement. And a lot of people think, great, look at the size of that market. Look at China, it's epic. So we'll just jump in there and take full advantage of that. And all of these are incorrect on at least a level, if not many levels.
There's nothing in that foreign investment about domestic housing or anything, is there? No, I mean, because obviously there's a push on price, but then I live on a street where there's 3 houses sold for
There actually is, but it's way up there. I mean, you're talking about a castle when they start looking into domestic purchases, unless you're talking about a government entity. The Chinese government can't buy a parking space in Australia without going through the Foreign Investment Review Board. A state-owned enterprise can't do that. In the last election, there was promises made, and they've been kept about agricultural land. So for agricultural land, if it's $15 million or above, it's going to go to the review board. And if it's a food production facility, an agribusiness of any kind, it's 53 million. If it's not a farm itself, but it's a production facility or something of that nature. Whereas the threshold for investment now in general has been raised to $1.94 billion. So they have to invest over $1 billion to get scrutiny. Same as the United States got, same as Japan got. The ones that everybody's afraid of, the agricultural land, is very low threshold for review. The one that most people don't think about straight off is that how much foreign investment from China is private foreign investment versus a state-owned enterprise. So there's quite a bit of it that's always going to be reviewed. Private is huge from China, but it's a small percentage of Chinese investment. Again, the place you have to consider scale. It may be a small percentage of Chinese investment, but it's a huge amount of money. So private investment is different. That still has the agriculture rules, but for example, purchasing domestic property, household property.
Just raises the price, doesn't it? I mean,
It can, yeah, absolutely. There's competition. Sydney is, yeah, it's it would be a novelty to find an Australian neighbour in some of the neighbourhoods up there.
These houses are empty. They bought them for over $1.5 million, and no one has been there for 2 years, 7 years in the case of one.
Yeah, yeah.
2 years empty.
Yeah, yeah.
The perfect holiday.
Great neighbours. They're quiet.
Have a party whenever you like.
They're a bit tough to borrow something from, but if you manage it, you never have to return it. But
Aren't they coming as business migrants and they have to show some?
Uh,
Show some investment happening?
Generally, I think business migrants have to literally be running a business as well, so it's not just the ownership of the assets.
From my discussion with it, it's about the fact that it's not the 70-year rule. The government won't take it from you in 70 years, and it's for future generations, you know, they'll sit on it because they can't own it for life in China. So.
It's a way of holding assets in a form that obviously the investor feels secure in.
at the same time, I've never actually met an Australian farmer, never met one who turned down Chinese money. Not one. They don't seem to be too afraid of it.
As you say, there is the debate about foreign investment, but one of the responses to that is to say that, well, yes, but there is quite an elaborate regulatory structure applying to foreign investment in Australia, and that applies to Chinese foreign investment too. So what's happened essentially is that the treatment of agricultural investment from China has been lined up with that from Korea and Japan.
And the United States.
Ross Giddens writes for The Age, and I'm sure I read an article last year where he said, aren't we, Australia, actually buying back the farm? That in that calendar year, Australia's direct foreign investment to China exceeded that the other way around.
Well, you can get a sense of the foreign investment flows on the page on the front of the handout with the red flag on it. So you can see the difference between Australia's investment in China and China's investment in
And that's a
Australia.
really good point, because one of the things this agreement should do, and I say should because one, you have to take advantage of it, and two, we haven't seen it yet. But what it should do is allow greater foreign ownership of businesses in China, greater flexibility in foreign ownership in businesses in China. And that actually is a great opportunity that others don't have. That's one of those preferential treatment options that we will have and can take great advantage of. But that said, one of the things I said earlier was this will make it easy to do business in China, right? That's a lot of people think. Well, not only do you have to know how to take advantage of the agreement itself, but you have to know how to do business in China. That's not going to get any easier.
Those numbers are, pretty close.
Yeah.
The 29
Yeah.
billion versus 31 billion essentially.
Yeah, so there is.
Investment in shares and.
Yeah, it's both forms are in there.
Stipulate whether
Doesn't
it's direct
stipulate,
or-
yeah.
Yeah, that one's direct.
there you go.
Yeah.
Okay.
But,
But the point is, the agreement, as David says, the agreement we'd expect to find when we see the detail, facilitate foreign investment in China. And that's, as we discussed earlier, that's a very important mode of delivery for services firms some of whom want to set up there.
Can I just say, it always seems to me that fair trade agreements, they're a great economic policy, but the social policy, perhaps not so good. And I'm talking about the dynamic of the workforce and looking to the future. So if we're primarily digging stuff out of the ground and growing stuff, we're prime production stuff, and you're saying that as China increases in its middle class, they're going to become more educated, wealthier, perhaps have, they're going to enter into the secondary sort of production market. And where does it leave us? Because the stuff on the ground is going to run out one day, and we haven't got a manufacturing sector anymore. We won't have the services will be matched by an educated Chinese population. Can I get your viewpoint on that sort of issues?
Yeah, there's certainly a concern amongst some of the professional sectors that they will be competing against Chinese providers sooner rather than later. I remember being with some architects one day who were saying that how great it was the Chinese Olympics and how much work the architecture sector got in China then, but ruefully pointed out that all these people had set up offices in China and the Chinese architect sector was growing rapidly, and it wouldn't be long before, and this may have already happened, Chinese firms would be setting up in Australia and competing against us here. So the response to that is to say, yes, that's certainly a possibility, but we have to think about it in the same way that we've thought about manufacturing. So what is it that we're relatively good at? And how do we get a return on that?
The whole comparative advantage.
But it may. What's happening now is it may not be the whole production process. It may be part of it. And so, so if you take a finished product, there are a whole lot of stages of production. So what's happening is that there's greater ability now to break up that production process and locate parts in different places. So I'd suggest the same argument applies to services. I mean, I'm a manager of a business in the education sector. I've got the same challenge. In some of my markets, I think my Chinese competitors are very strong. Particularly, I'd say that in undergraduate education, Chinese universities are terrific. Chinese universities are great in a lot of research areas and postgrad education, but we've got the edge in some markets. So I'm expecting that my business will focus more on postgrads rather than undergrads over time. I mean, the numbers now are still large, and the Australian dollar's been great benefit to us, but the long run haul is, I think David and I should be getting organised for picking our place in the postgrad market. So I'd be expecting services firms around Adelaide to be doing the same. What is it that we're relatively good at, and what can we sell to China?
Well, two things. One is an example that's probably half decent for students to put in front of students, and another is just a question about what happens in the absence of an agreement. And I'll start with that one. So we have a preferential agreement in China. So China is getting more economically secure, a growing middle class. They're becoming a consumer class. They're becoming more and more educated, so they're competing in all of these areas. And the future is bright. Even if growth doesn't grow at 9%, grows at 6%. Well, look at the economy you're talking about, and again, what's 6% of the biggest? It's a lot. So here they go. They're going this way.
Interruption.
So we don't. Okay.
The ANZ modelling is in here. So there's a picture with a whole lot of circles in it. The growth of the Chinese consumption market.
No.
So even in a short period, they're suggesting that the value of spending in China will double.
before the trade agreement, they're our largest trading partner, and all of these things were still true about China. So why is a free trade agreement going to change any of the things that you're worried about? They're already here. They'll just clobber us without us getting any benefit, if that's going to happen. But actually, we're thinking beyond that. And the idea of where we fit in the economy and how we operate in the economy is very important. And to that end, this is the thing that I like to tell students, and just go down to Coles or Woolies and find a home brand in a can, whatever it is. Baked beans is a good one. Go down and find a can of home brand baked beans, pull it off the shelf and turn it around. I can guarantee you it says made in Australia from domestic and imported ingredients. And most people, most good Australians will turn around and say, oh, that should be made here, that all should be Australian stuff. And I turned it around, I said, you know what, maybe, but there's a good chance that that can would say imported if all of the ingredients had to come from Australia. So the jobs and the process and everything that goes into that that's done here is done because it's efficient to do it here because we're allowed to import.
Anyway, so this is breaking down the production process.
Yeah.
This is breaking down.
Those 100 stitches in the shoes is more efficiently done in Massachusetts.
And where's the money in that? Where's the money in the can of beans? Is it in the beans that cost 3 cents? That can cost me $1.50. Where's the money going? Those shoes cost $150 a pair. An upper by itself costs nothing, and the sole by itself costs nothing. When you put 100 stitches in it, it becomes $150.
So
and who keeps it?
Terrific story about an Adelaide accounting firm that was had a great idea about running reports for its clients, and it was going well, but they realised that if they shifted offshore the part of the data processing work, which could be done very professionally, they could offer an even cheaper service. So essentially they broke up, even within an accounting firm, you can think about breaking up the stages of the process and shifting some offshore. So that strategy, I think, is going to be a critical part of the response. Yeah.
The media industry does that, the IT,
architects
they've got people all over the world
are getting drawing done in offshore, and possibly one of the university would like to think that one of the benefits that having domestic and international students working together is that the relationships that are formed are part of the future business connections as well. So we're doing some work with the architects on when they choose international partners, how do they find them? And one of the hypotheses is it's someone I went to university with, and I know them, and we had to bid on a job, so I knew he or she was strong in this part of the project, so I called him up and said, or I Skyped him, or I emailed him and said, come into the team. We're going to run out of time here. Do you want to do how will South Australia gain?
Yeah, sure. A couple of really quick ones, but just get there. Two-way trade between Australia and China in 2011-12, $127 billion. China, Australia's largest export market and largest source of imports. Largest agricultural export market, largest source of international students, largest source of international tourist expenditure in Australia, the second number. I wonder who the cheapskates are. But China is the largest and fastest growing market for Australian services. This is huge. And you saw that graph that ANZ had about services. They're down here, and they're huge. So that's going up. Services don't tend to run out. He provides somebody a service. He doesn't have to, that's not, it's not a one-time deal. He's going to do it over and over and over again. That's not a bad resource. As long as this stays active, you keep doing it. So very important. But how do we gain? Agriculture and natural resources, you can't ignore the fact that that's a big win for us.
Probably the berries have helped.
Hey, this is, but this is right. I skipped over a slide, and I'll tell you an anecdote about a mango producer up north who is a horticulture producer. Now, horticulture tariffs will be gone in 4 years. It'll phase out, but they'll be completely zeroed in 4 years.
Chinese don't buy one, they buy a box.
Well, not just buy a box. This guy figured out that every once in a while as he's going through his mangoes, he comes across one that looks like a football, and it's perfect, and there's not a blemish on it. And so he instructed his guys when they pick those, pick them really carefully, bring them someplace special. They wrap them up in a special box with special padding, and when it gets to the other end, a guy with cotton gloves reaches in and grabs it and delivers it to the customer for only $30 a mango. Not bad, hey? You know, and meanwhile, the guy with the same trademark sells the regular mangoes at an elevated price because they're associated with the great mangoes, and they're from the clean, pristine, beautiful Australia as compared to other places that food might come from. We have a great reputation for clean and green and pure and good quality. That's the market.
Buy our stuff on those levels? Or?
Yeah.
And more and more.
Do you remember do you remember the milk scare? Yeah. There was
they trust us.
They don't trust their own product.
I remember listening to AM one morning, and they interviewed a young Chinese family who was. She said, "I've got imported milk powder in every cupboard in the house." You remember?
They buy it from Chemist Warehouse, it's on special.
Yeah.
Yeah, they buy it from Chemist Warehouse, it's on special.
Information item in the Hogan report. There's a really neat graphic of the commitments on agriculture. That's a nice summary.
One thing in there when they talk about services, specifically insurance is in there. And China mandates every driver has third-party liability insurance. There's a ready-made market for you. There's a couple of cars. If you've ever been to Beijing, there's 1 or 2 people driving up there. And education, tourism is the biggest service export in Australia. Education is number 2.
And those two are not unrelated.
No, absolutely not.
So
and
families visiting students.
And they're not related, and they're not unrelated to our agriculture exports either.
And they're not unrelated.
This may sound a silly question, but how does communism and political control influence how easy it is for their locals to get out of the country?
I'm not up to date with the tourism regulation, but that's a good question. The part of a concern in a free trade agreement is to deal with restrictions on people leaving the country. And my recollection is that for international travel there was a system of sort of approved destinations, and we were on that list. So there is a regulatory apparatus there that we have to deal with. That I recall that isn't in place in other countries. But a topic for a gathering like this on another day might be the relationship between economic reform and political reform, but we'll put that on the table over there in the corner just for now.
I think with that, we're probably going to have to wrap it up. Thank you all for coming. I think it was a
Thank
great
you.
discussion. Thank you, Christopher.
Thanks for coming.